Demon's Souls Remake is pretty much a dead game at this point, at least as far as multiplayer is concerned. There are still a few players trudging through the realm of Boletaria here and there, but it's almost impossible to find organic co-op or invasions at anything other than lower levels. Fight clubs at the meta level of 125 are almost entirely non-existent. It wasn't always like this. In fact, from the time of launch in November 2020 until it was effectively killed by the release of Elden Ring in February 2022, Demon's Souls Remake got a small, tight-knit, but vibrant and active online community. It was a special game during a special time in history, and we're going to try to capture some of the reasons why in this video, because this is a game that deserves to be documented, both for nostalgia's sake, for those who lived through it, and for informative purposes for those who may have missed the bus. This video is a collaboration with my friend Dunbeetle, who played both the original and remake, and who had the idea to do a retrospective on this game that means a lot to both of us. Actually, this game is how we met and became friends. He spent a lot of time on the script and asked if I'd be willing to use my editing and voiceover skills to turn it into a video, to which I gladly agreed. You can check out Dunbeetle's channel with a link in the description below. So without further ado, let's get into why Demon's Souls Remake was a special game. Before we talk about the remake, it probably makes sense to spend some time talking about the original Demon's Souls, the game that started it all. Most gamers have heard of Dark Souls by now, and if you play video games at all, you've almost certainly heard about Elden Ring, unless you've been living under a rock for the past 2 years. Souls games, as they've come to be called, are renowned for their difficulty, unforgivingly throwing you into a brutal world with few instructions and no way to adjust the harsh difficulty. There is no easy mode, and the only way to progress in the game is to get good. The first of these games was Demon's Souls, released as a PS3 exclusive back in 2009. Demon's Souls was a spiritual successor to an earlier FromSoft series called King's Field, which was also brutally difficult, but didn't feature any multiplayer mode, which makes sense since there was no online functionality back in the day when the series was released for the original PlayStation. Demon's Souls was languishing in development hell when Hidetaka Miyazaki took over. Miyazaki, inspired by people in his Japanese hometown who would help each other by pushing cars over snow-covered hills, decided to add a co-op mechanic where you could summon friends to help you through levels. He also instituted an interesting mechanic known as an invasion, where you could go into another person's world and kill them to prevent their progress in the game, something that remains relatively controversial to this day and which has had several tweaks over the life of the series to make it more difficult for invaders to disrupt players who enjoy the PvE or player versus environment part of the game. The invasion element of the game, by contrast, was labeled PvP, or player versus player, and those who enjoyed it began making dedicated fight clubs where you could duel other players and test your skills in a more controlled environment without having to worry about any of the PvE elements of the game. Demon's Souls was initially met with negative press in Japan, but began to gain greater traction after it was released in the West. In an era where games had become known for coddling players with tutorials and easy modes, and better known for cinematic cutscenes than for rewarding gameplay, Demon's Souls was a breath of fresh air for those who wanted a challenge in their video games. The game ended up becoming something of a cult classic. The only problem was that it was exclusive to the PS3, and so it didn't gain a wider audience. That changed significantly with Dark Souls, the spiritual successor to Demon's Souls, which was a multi-platform release that expanded upon and refined the game mechanics of Demon's Souls and is widely considered one of the most influential games of all time. This led to a renewed interest in Demon's Souls, but unfortunately, many people who didn't have a PS3 still couldn't get their hands on the game, and sadly the Demon's Souls servers were shut down entirely in 2018, making it virtually impossible for people to experience the multiplayer aspect of the game on anything other than private servers. Fast forward to 2020 when the Demon's Souls remake was announced as a launch title for the PlayStation 5. FromSoft had no role in the remake, which was handled instead by Bluepoint, known for their previous remakes of games such as Uncharted and Shadow of the Colossus. This announcement was met with great anticipation. Finally, people who had come to the Souls series, which at that point consisted of 3 Dark Souls games, as well as the related games of Bloodborne and Sekiro, would be able to experience the game that started it all. This anticipation was heightened to a greater extent by the fact that Elden Ring, which was much hyped at that point after several years in development, was only a couple of years away from launch. There were 3 major factors that affected the Demon's Souls remake at launch. First, the game was launched at the height of the COVID pandemic. Lots of people were still locked in their homes during quarantine without anything better to do than to play video games all day. Second, there was a severe shortage of PS5s that would last for the better part of 2 years. Only now are you starting to see PS5s in stock at places like your local Target, Walmart, or GameStop. But back in 2020, and even well into 2021 and 2022, if you wanted a PS5, it meant keeping an eye out for the latest drop and hoping that you could scoop one up before all your competitors, which included quite a few unscrupulous scalpers who wanted to snatch them up solely for the purpose of reselling them for exorbitant prices. Third, there weren't a lot of PS5 titles at the time of launch, and the library of games wouldn't grow for a long time thereafter. So if you did manage to get your hands on a PS5, this also made it highly likely that Demon's Souls would be a game you'd pick up, given that it was a launch title designed to show off the PS5's incredible graphical capabilities. These three factors were good in some ways and bad in others. The bad was that not as many people got to experience Demon's Souls Remake at launch as one would have originally anticipated. While the hope was the remake would expose Demon's Souls to a new group of players who had never had the opportunity to experience the original, and it did to a certain extent, it also meant that unfortunately, once again, Demon's Souls was going to remain a niche game that not a lot of people had an opportunity to play. One of the first community experiences was figuring out what was hidden behind the door. It didn't take long before some players noticed that in World 1.3 there was a locked door that hadn't appeared in the original. When some players used photo mode to look over the wall on the opposite side of the door, they noticed a suit of armor lying on a bench. While it only took a few days for the mystery to be solved involving the new item, ceramic coins, which could be found in the new Fractured World and traded with Sparkly the Crow in World 4.1 for a rusted key. This revealed that behind the unlocked door was the Penetrator armor, an armor set that fans of the original had long wanted to wear because it just looked so freaking cool, and now they finally had the opportunity to do so. The second thing that comes to mind is the gold coin glitch. Now, this is something that wasn't intentional, but if you used a gold coin and then talked to the Maiden in Black in the Nexus, your luck would rise to an absolutely insane amount. You could then combine that with the Blue Blood sword, which scales with luck to pretty much one-shot everything in the game. This has since been patched out, but if you have a disc version of the game, there's still a workaround where you can do a version of it. Dunbeetle has a video on how to do this that I'll also link in the description. Finally, and perhaps most importantly though, was the feeling of community that developed around the game amongst those of us who were lucky enough to get a PS5 and who were trapped at home during the COVID pandemic. In the Discord, on Reddit, PSN chats, and on YouTube, there were just a great group of people who collaborated with one another to make this a fun and unforgettable experience. For example, the official Discord ran a charitable campaign known as the Coin Runners, where anyone who wanted to get the key for the Penetrator armor could make a donation of any amount to a charity of their choice, and then have the ceramic coins dropped for them at Sparkly the Crow. This was a great way to raise money for good causes and help people get the cool new Penetrator armor without having to go through all the hassle of finding the coins in the Fractured World. And by the way, they're still running this campaign as of the date of this video if you're still interested. The Discord and Reddit also facilitated people's abilities to fulfill Miyazaki's dream of helping their neighbors push their cars up the snow by allowing people to seek help for co-oping various missions. Unlike the original, the remake has a password that allows you to specifically summon specific players without having to worry about level restrictions, so if you find yourself constantly being invaded by some twink one-shotting you with maxed out weapons, you can just summon your max level Blue Phantom buddy to help take him out. And of course there were the fight clubs, where those of us who enjoyed the PvP could duel to our heart's content. While there are only maybe 4 or 5 viable PvP builds in Demon's Souls, far less than more recent Souls games like say Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, it made the fights a lot more fair in certain ways because you didn't have the chaos of lots of unbalanced builds that required constant patching. 2 major fight clubs that come to mind are the one that was run by Hell's Servant 23 in the US and the one run by Meadow H in the EU. There were lots of friendly rivalries within and between these two groups, which sadly seem to have died out. Lastly, in the PvP realm was the reintroduction of a player versus player boss in the unforgettable Old Monk fight, with Miyazaki himself saying in an interview linked below, "If we're talking about a boss that I'm most proud of, it would probably be the Old Monk from Demon's Souls. In this boss, we had something unique, adding a new outlet of fun. Was this encounter tweaked just right? No, but it certainly led to hours of fun should you have been inclined to partake." As well, those lucky enough to have gained newfound exposure to the series via Demon's Souls began to dig back into the Dark Souls trilogy, slowly but surely expanding the From Software community and player base. The Demon's Souls remake, like any game, had a drop in activity as the years wore on. It was a console exclusive on a video game system that was difficult to obtain, and a remake of an old game that was loyal to the original almost to a fault, including some admittedly outdated mechanics. Despite some of the new items and quality of life changes, Demon's Souls Remake was basically the original game in new packaging. We didn't even get the coveted 6th Archstone, which was another world that had been scrapped from the original. Lots of people were hoping it would be included in the remake, but alas, it was not to be, and seems unlikely that we'll ever get to play it now. While this level of fidelity meant that new players got to have an experience very close to the original, it also meant that outside of a few things like the new items and the Fractured World, there weren't a lot of fresh discoveries to be made. The original Demon's Souls was more than 10 years old by the time the remake had been released, meaning that pretty much all of the secrets had been documented a long time ago. Despite this, the game still had a fairly active player base until the final nail in the coffin arrived in February 2022, and that of course was Elden Ring. Most everyone who had been playing Demon's Souls dropped it to play Elden Elden Ring, and as the PS5 became more accessible, people who wanted to play a new Souls game would simply play Elden Ring instead. The PS5's game library also rapidly expanded around this time, which meant that the Demon's Souls remake, which had been one of the few PS5 games available for a really long time, no longer stood out. Additionally, the pandemic is over now, and so people who were trapped inside playing video games might just choose to do something else, like, I don't know, go outside? There are still people playing the Demon's Souls remake, but it's become something more of a curiosity at this point. Maybe a player will blast through it in a weekend simply to have completed the series. As well, a lot of the regulars who made the community something special have moved on. The developer Bluepoint also stopped working on the game a long time ago, and it hasn't received any updates since 2020, including never adding a way to delete save files. So it's unlikely that we're ever going to see the 6th Archstone or anything else in the way of DLC for the Demon's Souls remake. There just aren't enough people playing it to justify that kind of investment from Sony. The Demon's Souls remake, for better or worse, shares something else in common with the original now, which is that it's become something of a historical artifact that fans of the Souls series stumble over to every now and then and say, look, that's how it all began. But for a very short period of time, Demon's Souls Remake was a special game for a small community of people who were lucky enough to get a PS5 during the pandemic.